Hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon to those who are joining us from around the world today. Welcome to our first installment of Together While Apart webinar series. Thank you so much for waiting a few minutes to get started. We are now going to get started with our first theme, classroom communication. My name is Sarah Monteiro. I'll be your host for today. I'm also here with Patty West Smith. She's a veteran teacher and Turnitin Senior Manager of Teaching and Learning Innovations. So before we get started, let's take a look at some basic housekeeping rules and recommendations. The session will take around 30 to 45 minutes. All lines are muted, as you might have noticed already, because we are seeing quite a few messages on our chat. You can always send us messages and participate in our Q&As. If you have any questions throughout the session, please just send us a message and we will do our best to get to it during our webinar. If for some reason you still have questions at the end, you can also email us at communication-email@turnitin.com if you have questions or if you need any other information. And we will send a recording to you within 48 hours. Now, let's talk a little bit about why we are here today. As educators, over the past few months, you have been facing a lot of challenges that we could have never predicted. Institutions had to adapt their entire structures. Teachers had to start working from home. Students had to start studying from home. And that meant having to adapt to new distance learning environments that very often people didn't have the time to learn. So we were just thrust into this without being able to study or plan. So up until now, the main focus was into adapting and making sure our students were well and balanced, and the same thing for us, both physically and mentally, that we could keep up with all the changes that have been happening. Now, however, we find ourselves being able to find some structure in our day-to-day and conduct some actual instruction. So we are able to plan again and to get into classes, etc. But the realities of remote learning bring new challenges. Of the many shifts that instructors have been facing over the last few months, some of them are faced with methods by which we communicate with our students. So both in synchronous learning, asynchronous learning, being with the students in the same room or not, at the same time or not. So right now, Patty, please, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here today?
Hello, everyone, and welcome from all over the world. This is exciting for me. I'm in the United States, and I'm really thrilled to be talking to everyone as we're all sort of facing some of the same challenges despite our geographical locations or even our cultural settings. My background, I have about 23 years in education and education technology. I spent about 19 years working in public school settings. And I did a little bit of everything. I was a classroom teacher, a coach, a professional learning conductor. I wrote curriculum, designed assessments. I worked as a building principal as well as a district supervisor for an entire school district. So I've worn a lot of hats, and now I've been here at Turnitin leading the Teaching and Learning Innovations team for about 4 years. I have a variety of degrees in education and literacy and educational leadership. And I've also taught at the higher education level, working with emerging teachers or teacher preparation programs. as part of my experience in public schools, I spent a lot of time working in what is sometimes called anywhere, anytime learning. In particular, as that relates to technology initiatives and sort of one-to-one device initiatives where all students have are issued a device so that they can learn in anywhere, anytime, and are integrating technology regularly into instruction. I sort of have over time evolved and specialized in literacy, writing in particular, curriculum development, and even some a little lesser to a lesser degree, some second language learning applications as well. So I've done a little bit of everything in education, and now we've arrived at this particular moment in time, and my background in effectively integrating technology and working sort of outside of a traditional walled classroom setting has become very relevant to our current state of affairs around the world.
Absolutely. Thank you, Patty. Let's get started. Super excited as well to hear the tips and so much about your knowledge. So I have a few questions for you here. So can you tell us why the focus is on communication today?
Sure. When we sort of entered into this phase of learning that we're in, we started talking about what are some core principles to support teachers. And one of the underlying elements that goes across every aspect of education is effective communication, whether you're talking about delivering instruction or creating rapport with your students or even assessment. All of those have an element of communication, a common element. And there are some practices that we thought it would be best to highlight. And additionally, communication requires a lot of pre-thinking in the environment that we're in now with remote learning. You have to do a lot of planning because you don't have the luxury of face-to-face interaction where if you forget something, you can just bring it up in class or you can give a reminder. That's not quite as easy in this setting. So we thought it was important to start with effective communication principles that would work in our current setting.
And how will I help my students combat a feeling of having limited live access to personalized support? Because just like you said now, you're not in classroom. It's not like you can just bring up things out of nowhere.
It's sort of the nature of education that we rely a lot on our relationships with our students, and relationships in many cases are built off of interaction. When you limit that interaction, the reality is there is a sense of a loss of personalized support. And so I think you have to start by acknowledging that, to say, I do realize you're feeling this way, and here are some ways I'm going to combat that. One of the primary sort of starting places that you want to start about is being very intentional about scheduling shared times for group communication. Now I'm going to break that down. First, schedule it. It shouldn't be haphazard, and students need advance notice around it, right? It's important for both the instructor and the students to know well in advance what those times will be so that everyone can plan around it. And then shared times. So you have to be mindful of where your students are all over the world in their different settings, and understand and try to identify what those best times are. And when you think about that shared time aspect, it's really important to take some time to listen to your students as well, right? Remember that communication is two-way, so we have to take input from them as well and understand now that they're not on campus potentially, where are they? What are their time zones? What are the restrictions that they're working with? That's not to say that you can accommodate every specific individual situation. You'll have to work those out, but at least you can be mindful of it ahead of time. So you have to collect that information, and then you want to think about how to structure group communication, right? Because it's not just you as the instructor speaking to your student, or even an individual student speaking to the instructor. You have to be mindful of how your students can interact with one another. That might not be live. It might be live. There are different ways you can approach it, but you have to think about all of those things ahead of time, plan them out, and then share them with students, again, well in advance to the greatest degree possible. So that's really important. You also want to be thoughtful about those students who can't participate live for any number of reasons, because that is entirely possible. So you want to think about how can you provide a recorded or documented backup plan for those students. And again, make sure they know about it ahead of time, because students get a lot of anxiety around the idea that they might miss out on those live times. If you let them know ahead of time what that backup plan will be, it's going to make it so much easier for them to sort of feel calm and at peace and be able to figure out what will work best for them. And we know that this group communication is incredibly important for students, even for adults. So for example, folks like us who work from home on a regular basis often feel a sense of isolation because they're not interacting directly in sort of physical proximity with their colleagues, with their peers. And students are going to feel that too. And it will likely be more abrupt for them because they didn't have any chance to prepare themselves for that ahead of time. So it's really important to think about all those aspects. And then you want to think about how you can facilitate interaction and support from peers. So not just in that live setting, how they can work together to support each other. In the way that comes very organically and naturally in the classroom, it's much more challenging outside of the physical classroom setting. So you have to plan that out in advance. And again, communicate with students about what that will look like for them.
So more than ever, it is very important to have structure, to prepare really well these interactions as well, and to not let aside, to not let slip the group communication, to allow students to communicate with each other. What about communicating with the teacher? So those students who don't really feel comfortable talking in big groups and they prefer or need this one-to-one time.
Absolutely. So again, you want to think about this in advance and remember that while that group interaction is incredibly important, it's also important, again, thinking back to those relationships between instructors and their students, that you allow for some one-on-one interaction. That means things like scheduling one-on-one appointments with students for check-ins, allowing sort of sign-up times for students to have a direct line of communication to you to reach out. And it doesn't always have to be video. For example, you can set up a chat area where students can pose questions, much like our participants today are posing some questions as we're talking. You can do similar things for your students. You can set up discussion boards. So there are a variety of ways you can do that. But again, it's important to think it out ahead of time and then communicate it to students. I do want to emphasize though the importance of scheduling that time, right? Because again, lives look different today than they did a couple months ago. It's going to be really important for people to have as much advance notice as possible so that they can start to think about what will apply to them, how they can schedule around it to the greatest extent possible. And again, always have a backup plan. If students are going to miss a live interaction, whether it's in a group setting or a one-on-one setting, you want to make sure that you have some way to still communicate the critical information, whether that's in print or a recording, and you want to centralize locating that so that students can easily access it. Again, in part because you want them to have the information, but also to reduce the anxiety that comes with the feeling that they might have missed something that's really important.
Absolutely. I'm sure that there is a lot of anxiety in times like this anyway, so it's just to reduce this anxiety that they have. Now, you did speak a lot about scheduling and the importance of doing that, but a lot of students are facing and having to learn as well new technologies. So how do you ensure that your students can always know when learning activities are occurring and where to find the information that they need?
Absolutely. So there are a couple things you can do in this regard. I think the first thing you want to do is to set up a centralized communication hub. So whatever tools you're using, whatever different types of communications you have happening, you want to centralize that all in one place so that if students lose everything else, if they forget everything else, we've all had this experience with paper, right? But the same thing is true in a digital or virtual environment. So you want to have one sort of source of truth, one place they can go to where they can get back out to all of the other resources. And so that there's always sort of, I think of it as a home base, a return spot that students can always go to. No matter where they get lost or what they're looking for, they can go back to that centralized place and everything will map out from that. Again, it streamlines the process. It makes it easier for you to make sure everything is sort of sorted, organized together, it also puts a lot of reassurance in place for students to know that they can always go back to that one place and find at least links to wherever they're going, whether it's a video recording or a downloaded document or a specific resource or activity you want them to read. They can always go back to that centralized location and find what they're looking for, at least get a pathway out to it. If it isn't located there, they can find the links to it there. Mm-hmm. The other thing is to talk about a shared calendar. We talked about scheduling things, which is obviously critically important for both student and instructor. It's important that there be an overlapping space, a shared calendar where students are able to see where you're all on the same page. I've found with students I've worked with, this can be a real learning curve for them because there's an element of sort of metacognition and even maturity that plays into this, and they may not be accustomed to scheduling out their lives in that way. So it's really important that teachers provide the model. So it serves the communication process, but it also models for them an effective way to organize their time and their resources. It makes sure that students don't lose sight of things like upcoming due dates or important group sessions. It gives an opportunity for them to schedule those one-on-one times. And again, because it's shared, it is interactive between the instructor and the student. So it isn't just one way.
So you spoke about, managing expectations in a way so that students know what's coming, what is it that they need to prepare for, the importance of streamlining and having consistency. So you always know where to look for this information, where you can find it if you lose it for some reason, and the importance as well of sharing a calendar with the students. These are really, really nice tips to take in consideration. So consistency is key. Now, regarding the type of communication that we have with students, that has changed as well. So we're not communicating in person. How can teachers avoid misalignment, misunderstanding about what's expected from them, what process they should follow, what products they should use, what softwares? What would your suggestion be in this?
Well, so I think there are a couple of things. First, from the planning side for you, you have to start by making sure that you find the right tool for a specific task, right? Because there are so many different tools and apps and softwares and platforms that you can use, but it's important to match the tool to your objective. You want to make sure that you are thoughtful about what's my intention behind this particular type of communication and what tool is going to best support that. So for example, giving students feedback, for example, when they're writing, as they're drafting through the process, you want to be able to tag specific things in their writing. You want it to be iterative. You want to be able to loop back and forth and have some interaction. That's different than, say, communicating an overview about an assignment that might be more extensive, but is sort of a one-time thing. So you want to be thoughtful about what tool lends itself best to each of those tasks and then tie that to your central communication hub, right? But it is really important to be thoughtful and not just sort of pick the tool that maybe is immediately at hand because comfort is important, but you also want to be thoughtful about whether it will best serve your purpose. Once you've done that, you want to use it very consistently so that there is no miscommunication or missed opportunities. And then you have to start to think about what I call anticipating the misunderstandings. So you have to ask yourself, not only what are my intentions, but what might my students run into as a misunderstanding? Where might this break down? What are the questions that I can anticipate ahead of time? What have students struggled with in the past? And you know a good bit about your students. You sort of know their patterns and habits, and that can help you to determine what is it that's likely to go wrong here. And I find that if you think about that and plan for that in advance, you can sort of put some safety measures in place, sort of like guide rails on a road, right? You can keep them from going off the road by planning for it in advance and then sharing it with students as it's necessary. But put those guardrails in place ahead of time It's a lot more work up front for teachers, but it saves you time down the road because you don't get students who just, sort of go wildly astray, and then you have to figure out how to get them back on the right path. If you put the guardrails in place up front, it keeps them from getting too far afield of where you intended.
Well, this leads me to the next question, actually, because you said it really well. Make sure you put these guardrails in place. So once you have a plan for addressing student misunderstandings, so anticipating, knowing what their questions are going to be, what else can you do to avoid these misalignments?
So I think one of the things we can do is over communicate. So if you're not sure, or if you assume that students will know something, say it anyway. If you said it before, say it again. These are principles we do in our classroom too, but they're pretty sort of natural, and they happen in the moment, right? But you have to plan for them in an asynchronous environment, because it's very challenging to sort of catch people on the fly. They're not all in the same place at the same time, so you have to be intentional about it up front. In particular, I found that in the context that has happened now, students are in a very relaxed environment in some cases. They're at home, in their bedrooms, sitting at their kitchen table, like me today, right? That's a different environment than our physical classroom. So some of the norms and procedures and expectations that we've established in our classroom feel more relaxed for them. That makes it so much more important for us to be explicit about our intentions, our expectations, what rules and procedures we expect students to follow. And we can't assume that they A, know those things, or B, will do it automatically, because this is a very different context. And so it's important to sort of reaffirm and reassure what those expectations are, and then communicate them over and over and over again. Repetition, unfortunately, becomes incredibly important. That can be challenging and frustrating for us as instructors, but it's really important for our students.
So you did mention over communication, right? Repeat it if you're unsure, and just say it again and again if necessary. Now we briefly touched on asynchronous learning. So if your students cannot be in the same place with you, in the same Zoom room, or if you're not sure which channel they're looking at, how would you ensure that they get this information, they see, they hear this information?
One word: document. Write it down. Again, even if you've already said it before and you assume they know it, and there are some things that you think, oh, well, of course they know to do that, write it down anyway. Because A, you're not all together. Students need to be able to go back to that, whether it's, it might be in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning, but they might have a question about how to do something. If you can write it down, it's a really good idea, because that it sort of gives them a reference point. They can go back to it anytime they need to. It also helps you to think these things out ahead of time. I talked earlier about this idea of anticipating misunderstandings. Well, I find that when I write things out that normally I would have just explained aloud, I often think about, oh, well, they might not understand what I mean by that. And then you can write it out, or give a definition, or link to another resource. And by really thoroughly documenting all of that, you are creating sort of a record, right? You know that you communicated it, and you can send students to it over and over again. If the same question comes up from 20 different students, which we know happens all the time, you have that one source of truth. You can point them to that document and say, in this file, you can take a look. I walked out exactly what I wanted you to do, and I answered the questions ahead of time. When you have students say things like, how long does it have to be? When is it due? All of those repetitive questions, once you have them in writing, it will save you some time and give them a reference point, even if you're not available. Because remember, in a lot of ways, they feel cut off from you. It would be easy at the end of class to just stop at your desk and ask you a quick question. That's a lot harder when you're not in person. Having it written down sort of takes away any of the barriers there around that communication, or at least lessens them.
So super important to document things, actually everything, from what I understood, in order for you as well not to have to repeat everything over and over again, and for them to access this information easily when and if they need it. Now, if instructors anticipate misunderstandings, they over-communicate, they document everything, is there anything else that they might do to ensure students are aligned to their expectations?
Absolutely. So, here at Turnitin, we talk a lot about the importance of feedback. And there's been a ton of research that has proven that feedback is actually one of the most effective tools we have to impact student learning, because teachers can directly control it. We can provide it over and over again. We can change it and adapt it to specific students and their needs in the moment. What I find in this context, in this remote learning scenario, is that we have to give students feedback not only on their products, not only on the work that they're doing, but their process, how they're doing the work, right? Because this is a brand new learning environment for them. Most children in their early childhood learn how to behave in a classroom setting. They learn to raise their hand and take their time and wait their turn, and all of those sort of things that happen over the lifetime. This whole learning online, that happened very suddenly without any opportunity for us to sort of train our students in what's effective. So they're going to be doing some trial and error. They're going to make mistakes. And we as the instructors have to be willing to give them feedback, not only on the work they completed, but how they did it. You waited until the last minute to ask me this question, but you had this assignment 2 weeks ago. It's really important to provide feedback on that so that they recognize not to do the same thing moving forward. The other side of that is that you can also provide positive feedback, right? I really like the way that you advocated for yourself and asked this question ahead of time. I like the way that you clarified this point. I like the way that you asked your peer for support before you came to me. All of those things that we want students to do for themselves to make them effective learners, we can provide them feedback about it. Constructive feedback to steer them in the right direction when they make a mistake, and positive feedback to encourage them to continue things that are working really well. At the same time, I also find it's important for us as instructors to be honest about our mistakes too. This is new for all of us, instructors and students around the world. Some instructors may have had the benefit of some remote learning, but I find that right now in this sort of emergency situation that we've been in, there are still a lot of new challenges that we're all encountering, and we are not perfect either. And I find that it's really important to be honest with students about that, to acknowledge the mistakes you may have made so that they can see that you are learning too. It helps them to understand that you're human, for that relationship and rapport, but it also helps them to figure out that there is a process to learning and that it isn't always clean and easy. Sometimes we make mistakes along the way, but the important part is how we recover from them. So in this regard, teachers can be models sort of for that conduct and behavior, as well as delivering the content that is so essential to our classes.
Great. Really, really good to hear about feedback and how important it is, not just constructive feedback, but also to reinforce the good work that they have been doing. And also look at teachers, ourselves, of course, as students as well, that are learning to adapt to these new challenges, just like our students back at home that have a whole group of different challenges. Now, why is it that we are focusing today on pedagogy instead of educational tools?
Well, so the reality is we're in a constantly evolving situation. Things are changing from day to day. They're different from region to region and location to location. And it looks like that's going to continue for some time as the situation around the virus emerges and changes. There will be different responses to it in different areas. Different schools will take different tacks. And even the tools that we use might have to adapt and change, right? And so we decided to focus on pedagogy because those are core principles that aren't going to change. The things we've talked about today around communication, those aren't going to change. You might need to use a different tool in the future. So for example, I mentioned picking a tool that works for your objective. Which tool you use might change a month from now, 2 months from now, 6 months from now. But the reality is you're still going to want to be thoughtful about what it is your students need, what your objective in the learning is, and which tool makes it works best for that setting. So we wanted to focus on sort of what is universal and what will be consistent and true no matter what changes come to us down the road, because one thing we can be sure of is there will be changes. There will be new situations that we haven't yet experienced, that we haven't planned for. So if we stick to pedagogy and the best practices around all of this work, then we can be sure that we're on the right track, even if we have to find a different tool or a different methodology.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. We will now start getting into some of the questions that we have as well here from the attendees. So Patty, we have here one of our instructors asking, you know, they have a large high school, 7 high school classes in the US, and they are asking how you would suggest that the school handles a calendar. So they are hearing there is some frustration, not just from students, but also from some parents. In your experience, what would you suggest for this?
So it's funny because this boils down to communication too, right? It's a different kind of communication than what we've been talking about, but there needs to be communication across the school and across the instructors. And then it needs to be clearly communicated to both students and parents. You know, in my personal setting, and I'm more than 20 years of experience in education. Obviously, I have, experience that a lot of parents don't. But I've been frustrated through this process when, you know, my own student has had 4 different teachers who are using 4 different calendars and they don't match up and they haven't talked to each other. It gets very overwhelming. And it's overwhelming for the teacher too. You know, there are so many different possibilities. You sort of don't know where to turn and what to look at. So I think that if you stop, take a breath, talk to your colleagues, and try to coordinate as best possible. And again, be thoughtful about what tool best serves your objective. But in this case, it's important to consider the objectives of the whole group. So if you have a group of, you know, all the same teachers or all the same school, it's best if they pick common tools to use universally. It's going to cut down on figuring out new tools and having to go from place to place, which always results in chaos and lost passwords and other things. But if you pick a tool up front and then everyone sticks to it, then you can better communicate it out and sort of cut down on a lot of the uncertainty, a lot of the anxiety, etc. I understand that can be challenging, particularly right now because we're not all together. Normally, if we were going to do something like that, we could get in a big faculty meeting and we could all talk it out. That's not possible right now. So it may be necessary to sort of think outside the box, make sure you get input from everyone, and then kind of come to consensus around what you're going to do moving forward. And frankly, for right now, that time may have passed, right? Because we're getting close to the end of term in a lot of cases, depending on your calendar. But it's really important to be thinking about it moving forward. And if you have found that certain things you've done haven't gone well, you know what those mistakes are, what those pitfalls are, then be thinking about how you can change them moving forward. Again, we're all learning, so it's important to stop and be reflective. This worked well, this didn't work well, I'm not gonna do that again. And to share those learnings with your colleagues, including the leadership of your school in some cases.
So again, super important to have consistency, to pick something that works and to stick with it so that there is clarity in all levels of the institution.
Sure.
And another question here, how do we motivate students to turn off their videos and get involved in the lesson and participate?
So this is really challenging. And I'm going to say, first of all, it's important to know that there's not one right strategy. It's going to vary from school to school, teacher to teacher. So some things depend on your style as an instructor, but it also varies from student to student, because if I try one thing with Sarah, that might not work with another student down the road. So you have to be willing to, listen to students. It's important to try to find out what the root cause is of them disengaging. Are they disengaging because their little brother is in the other room crying and it's very difficult for them to pay attention? Are they disengaging because they're so overwhelmed by how different everything is that it sort of freaks them out and they can't handle it? Is it just too much information coming to them? We have students with learning disabilities who virtual interaction and screen time is very challenging for some of them. We have other students who respond better to print than to oral or auditory learning. So there are a variety of factors you have to consider. I think first, you have to drill down to exactly what the problem is. Second, I think it's really important not to lose track of personal contact, right? We do a lot of messaging that are to groups of students, whether it's a whole class or a whole grade or even a whole school. But when you have students who are disengaged, you have to find a way to interact with them personally. And sometimes that means going outside of traditional routes. You might have to resort to mail. You might have to use the phone. Obviously, in-person visits are not really an option right now, but there are other things that you can do. You can incorporate sort of if they're younger students in particular, not in higher education, you can reach out to parents and employ them as your sort of ally in this case. Also be thoughtful about if there are other adults that they might have a relationship with who might be able to help you. I've had students that just didn't respond very well to me, but maybe they had a coach that they responded really well to, and I might reach out to that person and ask them to help me make contact. So I think that's part of it. The other thing is you have to be willing to offer different options. Maybe there are reasons that we don't know and might never know that are getting in the way of student learning. So we don't want to assume that they have bad intentions. It's entirely possible that there are really good logical reasons that are getting in the way. So you have to offer some alternatives. I also think it's important to really focus on what's absolutely essential, right? You don't have 60 minutes of instructional time that you have to fill 5 days a week. We're not in that regimented setting now. So it's important to ask yourself, what is really critical? Maybe not every single assignment, classwork and interactive activity, but really pick the things that will have the biggest impact that you want students to focus on. And then this is really difficult for us as instructors because most of us are really driven to serve students and to help them. That's why we got into this work and chose this as our profession. So we have to try not to take it personally. It's really easy to say, well, Sarah just won't join my Zoom class and I don't understand it. And that's really frustrating for me. And I just don't know what else I can do to help her, and feel like we've just gone horribly wrong and get frustrated and lose our will to keep trying. But the reality is it might not have anything to do with us. There are other factors, and they're much more present in students' lives now that they don't have any physical separation. They can't go to the safety of a school building and have a buffer where they're removed from other influences in their lives. They don't have that safe place, where everyone is dedicated to learning. So a lot of things have changed for them, and it might not have anything to do with us. So I think it's important to keep that perspective and not beat yourself up too much.
And with that in mind, there is a similar question here in the chat, which is asking, if then you can't get your students to interact as much or to engage as much, and of course, despite not taking it personally, what other strategies would you recommend rather than just asking a question and telling, Patty to respond to it?
So one of the things, even in the classroom, in the physical classroom, I used to really advocate for my teachers to do this, is to set up systems that are not just sort of asking a question and then calling on an individual student to respond. Sometimes I like to create what we call every pupil responds. So you create setups where it's not going to be one student or even a couple of students who respond to a question. You have to set up a method for them all to respond, right? So that you know what each and every student is thinking. Now that's hard to manage in this setting, for example, because you don't want 30 students shouting an answer at you, right? But you can think about, is there a discussion board where they each could type their answers? Could you have them do it in a chat where each person has to respond? You take away a lot of the anxiety around that when they don't have to speak and sort of perform in front of their peers. It gives them a lot more freedom to sort of explore their ideas, and it has the benefit of making sure every single student weighs in. And if they don't, you know it as the instructor, right? If only one student answers your question, you can't be sure everyone else in the class understands.
Yes, really, really, really good. We have a few more questions here. We'll do our best to get through as many as we can. Another one here, what are some of the strategies to ensure independent examination or summative assessments of students apart from formative assessments, especially where even online examinations are supervised?
So the good news is we have a full webinar dedicated to this topic. This is a 3-part series. Today we're focusing on communication. In our next session, we're going to be talking about delivering instruction. Our final session, which is a week from today, is focused on assessment, how to deliver assessments so that you can be sure that it is your students' work, that you can be sure that you are measuring what you needed to measure and really getting an accurate idea of student understanding. We're going to dig very deeply into that topic. And if you wanted to check it out ahead of time, one of the blog posts that I wrote that I think is linked on our Turnitin blog post, you can go back and find it. It's dedicated to sort of what are some good practices around assuring assessment works well in this setting. And there actually have been other blog posts not written by me, but other members of the Turnitin team, and even some of your peers out in the field who have written about what practices work in order to ensure a good assessment scenario.
So please feel free to take a look at our resources. Another question here for you, Patty. What do you do? Again, I think this is a little bit about what you said, you know, to not take things personally. But one of the teachers is asking, what do you do when students misunderstand your goals based on the cultural and family background, and you get frustrated and you feel that a certain task is the one to help you achieve a given objective?
So I think there are a couple of things you can do. First, you have to acknowledge that you probably are going to feel bad in that moment. And it's okay for you to feel bad in that moment, because if you start to expect perfection from yourself under these circumstances, it's going to be really difficult. It's unlikely that you won't make a mistake somewhere. So if you're confident that the activity or the assignment that you designed is the right one for the goal, I think there are a couple things you can do. One, step back, sort of take yourself out of the picture, ask a trusted colleague to look at what you designed and see if they understand or can give you some pointers. You have to be willing to take feedback yourself, right? Because it might make sense to you, but it is important to remember that different family structures, different cultures have different expectations. So misunderstandings can happen. So sort of remove yourself a little bit from the situation and have a trusted colleague give you some feedback. That's the first thing, because it will help you reflect on what you might do differently and how you can change things. Second, you have to be willing to engage in some really honest conversation with the student or even the student's family to make sure that you understand what part of the information that I shared or the assignment that I designed or this assessment that I used, where did things go wrong for you? What were you thinking and feeling that made this not work for you? So that you can really understand sort of what led to the problem. That will help you better solve it. Once you know what really created the problem, then you can come up with the right solution. It's hard to just do that abstractly. And the other thing you have to be willing to do is to consider alternatives. Even if you think this is 100% the right way to meet your objective, is there any other way that you could meet that objective? And is there any harm in offering that alternative to students, especially if it will help to defuse a difficult situation? So I think flexibility is really important there, because like everyone else, when I design a learning activity, I have a very clear idea of what the right approach to that is, what the best way to build the learning and show mastery of the content will be. But I'm not perfect. And even if that works for 95% of my students, there may still be a handful of students who need a different path. And I think it's important to listen to them and to try to understand, and then to think about where you can be flexible.
Absolutely. So shifting a little bit now for the online communication that students have, for example, when they are in Zoom with students, a few of our teachers are saying here that because they tell them, you are going to receive a recording of the session, they don't actually show up to the class, or that they might use that as an excuse for not showing up and not participating during class. So what would be some strategies, or your opinion, is that really, really super important right now? And how would you deal with that?
So one, plan the activity so that the interaction is critical, right? If you plan the activity, let's say, for example, that you require students to post a question, or you require students to have some interaction with you to answer a question, or you use, as I recommended earlier, an every pupil responds, where every student has to respond to something, then they really need to interact live. And so they can't just tune out, or they're going to miss something, and you will have set that expectation up front. So that's sort of the front piece. The back piece is to really ask yourself if their live synchronous interaction is absolutely necessary. Can they get the information they need sort of from a recording? Can they listen to it later and reply to you, maybe post a question in a chat room or on a discussion board? If those things are possible and they still meet your learning objectives, maybe it isn't important that they participate live in that interactive session. And again, if you take some of the steps that we talked about in this hour we spent today together, if you set up one-on-one interaction times, if you set up document all of your information in writing, if you set up a consistent centralized communication hub, they're still going to get all of that information. And so you have to ask yourself if it is possible to be flexible. Can they still get what they need without participating live? If it isn't, then you need to be mindful of how you can build that interaction into the live session and set that expectation ahead of time. But if it is possible that they can get it outside of that time, maybe that's okay in our current context. Maybe it's okay to relax our methodology and consider a different approach.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Fadi. I think that was our last question. We will do our best to get back to any questions. But right now, I would like to let you all know that we have available a lot of resources for you. We have videos, downloadable resources, and best practices to make remote learning engaging and effective. Please go ahead and visit turnitin.com/remote learning. There are several tips and also some more technical videos that you can visit. Now, just as just to let you know as well, we have 2 more webinars. One of them on the 14th of May at 4 o'clock about instruction, and a second one about assessment. You can register for any of them within the next few days, and please feel free to join us again. Thank you very much for your time. If I would like to, on behalf of Turnitin and everyone that is involved today here at this webinar, I would like to thank you. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact us again. You will hear from us in the next couple of days. We will send you the link with the recording. Thank you very much for your time, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.